Hello guys, so here's my review of the Aurora Borealis Kodiak in K329 steel. I've been using this knife for several months now, and I've done some extensive and hard use testing. So first we'll talk about the steel. So what is K329 steel? So if you go on the side of the manufacturers, it's a steel produced by Bowler Steel in Sweden. They say it's a steel that's produced for high duty machines that cut cellulose, so basically wood, paper and fiberboard. So as you can tell, it's specifically made for wood chippers and machines that are used to cut wood. If we look at the composition of that steel, we see that it's very similar in composition to A8 mod steel. Actually, it's pretty much the same composition. So A8 mod is known to be a very tough steel with good wear resistance, and that is relatively stain resistant as well. If we compare both of them, they have moderate amounts of carbon, around 0.5. They have 8% chromium, some molybdenum, vanadium, and other components. So basically, what does that mean? It's a steel that's in the 8% chromium family, which gives it relatively it is more stain resistant than simple carbon steels, but because of the low carbon, it's also a steel with a very high toughness. So as soon as I got the knife, I started testing it. So I went in the shed, started batoning some hardwood, and it went through no problem. I even chopped through, a couple of knots, and it performed extremely well. So I was already pretty impressed by that. So that's before I did any of the further testing. After that, I wanted to check the sharpness, and as you can see, definitely, even after batoning, it remained very sharp. Could slice paper no problem. So I continued trying to cut through some man-made materials like this rubber tubing, no problem. So aluminum cans, slice through like butter, no problem. So we went a bit further, trying to see if I could whittle this brass rod, and it made some very nice shavings, and the edge wasn't affected at all. So that was a pretty good sign, showing that there's pretty good edge resistance. After that, I decided why not just go further and try to chop through that brass rod. So I whacked it pretty severely with the hammer and went through no problem. Next step was I tried to chop through this hardened steel nail. I don't know what's the hardness, but definitely it was harder than regular nails. So it took way more time, way more effort, and at that point I was a bit concerned that the edge could be affected, but it stayed good, so I continued chopping there. So it did take a while of whacking that spine. It's nice to note that the spine wasn't really affected that much, despite hitting it with a hardened hammer. And then we'll cut that nail in two. Next test, I wanted to see if the overall toughness of the blade. So I decided to chop through this brick. It's a full brick, pretty tough. Again, hitting it with a hammer, and well, nothing broke, stayed intact, and I was surprised to see that the edge wasn't affected that much. So here's I'll bring up a picture of the edge. So you see there's some rolls but no chips, and the roll really came from chopping that nail. So I wanted to check the tip toughness, so really try to go through that stump there, and as expected, it just broke through the stump, no problem to the tip. Even after exerting a lot of stress on the tip there, it didn't deform, it didn't bend at all. So definitely high toughness steel for sure. Yeah, definitely straight, no problem. So again, one step further, I wanted to go see if it could penetrate a steel sheet, and so I whacked it a couple of times. No damage to the tip whatsoever, so it went through, and so the tip wasn't blunted or deformed in any way, no breakage. So that was pretty impressive as well. As you can see here, the holes, a bunch of holes. So sometimes, you know, if you put too much strength on the on the side of a blade, it can snap. So I wanted to see, you know, how much lateral strength we had with this knife. Try to pull it as hard as I could. Nothing happened, no problem. So that's already a good sign. But decided to go further. So I decided to, you know, try to stick in a tree and jump on it, see if it would break. And yeah, so it didn't break. That took a while. And there, yeah, jumping on it, no problem. And again, so that's around 215 pounds, no problem. So no, it wasn't bent or broken in any way. So next step I wanted to do is to show, is it really that more corrosion resistant than SK85? I got no rust whatsoever on the K329, but significant rusting on the edge of the SK85. The next test was to see if it did have some advantage for the wear resistance of the edge, if it could hold an edge longer. So I did the cuts on that rope. My test was basically to try to cut the rope and then try to cut paper, and as soon as it didn't slice the paper anymore, I would just stop the test. And so that went off for a while. Even with the SK85, had pretty good edge retention. Cut around 60 cuts of that rope there before the edge was a bit dull. So that was pretty good. So I did the same thing with the K329. So I was able to cut significantly more. I think it was about 15 more cuts before the edge was a bit more dull. So again, the edge holding was better with the K329 than the SK85. So to finish, I added this graph from the Knife Steel Nerd website of Larry Thomas, and in this graph you can clearly see that A8 mod or K329 is a steel with a very high toughness, much tougher than 5200 or even A2, but at the same time it has better edge holding than either of these steels. On top of that, it has a better corrosion resistance than both 5200 and A2. So definitely a steel that has some great properties.